Welcome, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to you, Goetz and Chris. It's great to be with you on stage. So we are here to take a closer look at the IT infrastructure of banks, and we want to discuss why it's so important for financial institutions to use modern technology, not only in the interface with the customer, but also for the whole substructure. But first, I would like you two to introduce yourself in a few sentences, and especially tell us from which perspective you're looking on the subject we want to discuss. So maybe, Chris, do you want to start?
Absolutely, happy to do so. So first of all, welcome also from my side. Great to be here today. And Elinvar in the end is a platform as a service enabling asset manager, wealth managers to do exactly what we talk about today, changing the infrastructure in order to have a very, very modern infrastructure and then be able to adapt whatever is coming next. So that's what drives me to stay here today.
Perfect. Yeah, and you made headlines last week. Torben noticed it. Goldman Sachs invested in Elinvar. Your venture capital is now around 20 million euros, right? And so congratulations. What are you planning to do with the money?
I mean, for us, over the last 2.5 years, we basically built the platform, and now it's about scaling the platform, helping more partners of ours to enable really taking the digitalization as a chance. And I like to quote the Goldman Sachs website. So actually, it's the principal investment group which invested in us, and they said, okay, they're interested in the probably not that exciting stuff, but with a true leverage to really build something for the future. And that's what we try to do as well.
Great. Goetz, what about you? So what's your perspective on the issue? What's your background? Can you give us a little introduction?
Sure. Good afternoon to you. As you see, my name is Schellhas. I work for Roland Berger, but actually very deep in my heart, I'm still a banker. I've been in banking for over 20 years with Goldman Sachs and Deutsche Bank. And during my last job at Deutsche Bank, which was being the global head of risk management for the non-trading area, i.e. everything outside the investment bank, I kind of learned how to cope with an organically grown IT structure, which had a lot of difficulties to adapt quickly to that wave of regulatory requirements that came in. So that was quite a turning point. I originally came from the front office where things kind of work very nice. That highlighted to me that there are a lot of things that need to get done in order to get away from Excel and PDF and copy paste and then sending it on to the next guy to fill out the blanks and to become more efficient. So that's kind of what drives me here.
All right, so I think that's a good point. Let's jump directly into our discussion. So the topic is IT infrastructure from financial institutions. Where do we stand now? What's the status quo?
So at the moment, over the last years, most banks and most players in the industry invested quite a lot in order to optimize the front ends. But you can also say only the front end. So if you look at the architecture in itself, there was just a recent study that still most of the architecture is on mainframe computers. COBOL is still by far the dominant computer language that was invented somewhere in the 50s.
Right.
And this gives you an idea. So you can compare to the situation of a very, very old desktop, which was upgraded by external drives, by an additional SD card, by stuff like this. But everybody somehow knows that they need to shift to the modern new MacBook. I like to quote Apple, so don't be sorry for that. But you need to have this new MacBook in order to be able to adapt to whatever is coming next. So as a comparison again, everybody knows it. If you have a modern iPhone and there's a new update, you just connect it to the power, you connect it to the Wi-Fi, and next day you're done. If you still have the old desktop, it's basically a 6 months project in order to do the new update. And that's the situation in the industry as well. So we all know that you have like 2 years plans in order to adapt to something. You have a very, very old legacy system. Sometimes you have a lack of documentation. So you have the challenge that people really don't know what exactly happens if you change something. And for that reason, you can say the industry was one of the first to really invest in tech. And now it has the challenge that they have all these legacy because of exactly this fact.
All right.
I actually learned how to program in COBOL a long time ago, but maybe I don't look like it, but I wasn't born in the 50s. I'm a little younger than that. So what's the status quo? I agree with Chris saying that the front office actually looks kind of cool. If I think about online banking, if I think about features that are available to corporate clients, they kind of look cool. But I was more on the other side. I was in the engine room. What do I mean by the engine room? The engine room in a bank are the departments like finance, risk management, treasury, maybe pension liability, asset management, etc., and so forth. And dealing with these departments within my risk management function, I noticed, basically I had to deal with very, very many systems in the high double-digit numbers. You had to try to get data together in order to satisfy the regulators, to get the right reports out to the management board or to other stakeholders. And my view is that this is, for most banks, still the case. And it's really time to update, to come anywhere close to the functionality of these little things. But we're probably going to talk about this a little more later on.
Yeah, sure. I will absolutely do this. So I think what is clear to both of you is that there's no alternative to renewing the IT infrastructure. But yeah, you told us many banks, many financial institutions haven't done this yet. So, and I also can imagine that this is a high investment in money, in training your staff, in time. So what are the concrete benefits for a bank to renew their IT infrastructure? Why should they take this step?
So I like to compare it with the comparison to other industries. So when you look at modern digital platforms, like for example Facebook, Google, Netflix, whatever, they are able to individualize their service on a very, very high level. So we all know the situation. You open your Netflix, and my Netflix is different from everybody else's. And at the moment, I still have to switch whether it's me or my kids. But I would bet quite a lot of money that in a few years from now, the Netflix is actually able to tell whether it's my kids or me, maybe based on the first movie they open, whatever. If you want to have a level of individualization like this, it starts with being able to analyze all your data. This is something, for example, most banks are not able to do today. So there's a very common situation that in order to do, if you want to know a lot about your clients, and for example, if you want to do connections between the customer data, which is usually stored in some kind of CRM system, and the business data, which is stored in a different system, then you really end up with something like a 2 weeks analysis made in Excel. So Excel is still the most common bridge functionality or bridge IT. And this is okay if you're in a situation where you still have time. It's not possible anymore when you're in a situation where you have to individualize at scale and basically in real time. And this is the challenge that's coming to us. And we should not forget that we are still standing at the beginning. So when we look at digitalization, we are actually only at the starting point. And if you look at very large-scaled platforms like, for example, Ant Financial in China, serving millions of clients, they now started outsourcing their bank infrastructure to third parties. This is an IT platform which is by far more scalable and more powerful than most of the things we have in Europe. If we want to have comparable platforms and systems in Europe, we need to start investing in these.
I just mentioned the engine room. So how do banks deal with the problem at the moment? They're basically throwing people at it, which means many employees do work that is repetitive, not very analytical, but they do the job. But what that also means is it really drains the productivity of the firm as a whole. If you look at some infrastructure departments, during my experience, have 10 times as many employees as they did 10 years ago, simply just to cope with the regulatory requirements and all the other things that come with it. So I think the original question was, why do we want to do it? Obviously, yes. A bank from a business side is very interested in raising the profitability. There are some interim solutions, I call them plasters. They stop the bleeding, but they don't really cure the illness. Stuff like robotic process automation. That seems to work quite well. It basically takes on the jobs that a human being does, logging into a system, putting data in, taking them to another place, etc., and so forth. But again, this is not a permanent solution in order to cope with the future challenges that you have. So I think what banks really need to look at is that they are enabled to use data as a strategic resource. And the current legacy systems, and I mentioned before, some have like 30 to 50 legacy systems in parallel. They don't really enable managers to do that. So when we build something that I technically do not actually quite understand the way you described it, but that's okay, I guess, then I would expect various advantages from building that. Number one is really enabling the financial institution to use the strategic data and also other data in a smarter way, maybe applying advanced analytics. But at the same time, the data foundation will be so much better that I would expect banks to do better strategic decisions as well. You all of a sudden, with what you've described, can run scenarios, anticipate what might be, what might not be. So that's a big plus. At the same time, you'll free up a lot of employees' capacity to do other things, take them out of the simpler jobs, and hopefully educate them to do something more analytical to help the bank. And I guess that's enough for the time being. So in essence, it's really increase productivity and increase the ability to do better strategic decisions and hence modify the business model going forward.
All right, so we need leading edge technology instead of plasters, I guess. That's if you want to bring it on the point. So, but yeah, banks seem to struggle. So you told us often there is technology from the 50s. So what needs to be done to find a solution for this problem?
First of all, something which I think is very important to understand and to look at. Very often when I discuss topics like this, I get the question, okay, how should anybody pay for all of this? So we should realize that at the moment, according to a Gartner study, something like 20% of all global investments in technology are actually done in the financial industry. So there is no lack of money. The challenge is that most of this money actually is spent in order to run old systems. So what do you need to do? First thing from my perspective is you have to think about the whole thing not as an organization anymore, but more like an ecosystem. This is something at Bitkom we discuss this on a regular basis, and a lot of you in the room know this as well, especially when you're working on special solutions for certain fintechs. So you should look at the whole thing as an ecosystem and think, okay, what is really my core competency? What is really my business model, and what is the target operating model for that? And what are partners who can help me do that and reach this quicker? So I would think about the IT infrastructure not as something I necessarily need to run. All of us know cloud services as something which is a key thing to build up modern structures, adaptable structures. In the US, something like 73% of all businesses have their core functions in the cloud. In Europe, especially in the financial industry, most established players don't use the cloud at all. There are some who are now starting this. My hypothesis would be a few years from now, most companies are either in the cloud or out of business. Because if you really want to run an ecosystem, you need to have a flexible, adaptable infrastructure. Then you need to identify which services you need. Then you need to be able to combine these services. And then you can combine these according to your target operating model. And as I said, the important thing, this is not a question of limits of resources and investment money. It's more a question of how do I allocate my investments? And then you can choose partners, obviously like us, but depending on the business model, also like others who can help you with the platform for your respective topics.
So use open banking for improve your own system. So from your perspective, as you have lots of, you were years in working as a bank manager. So what would you suggest for a bank? What are the steps to take to renew your structure?
Well, first of all, I think the change to a new IT infrastructure will not happen in the form of a big bang. I would rather describe it as a very long and rocky road where the banks, when they come to the point that they want to do it, really have to take their employees along and then develop the existing people towards the new talents that they need and acquire new talents at the same time. Because if you don't take your organization with you, you will probably not realize what you actually want to achieve. That means that a continuous change management function, when you want to come up to a decision, has to be there. As I said, not a big bang. It's going to be step by step. So our suggestion actually is to do this in modules. Because if you do it in one go, it's going to be probably very expensive. And if you are able to identify IT and business models alike that fit together, then I think you can realize that step by step. And as you go along and get higher benefits from it, maybe the rest will go a little faster. Key is to really have a clear view on what the target operating model is and how the roadmap is supposed to look like, what are your milestones, etc. But once you've done all that, I want to reflect to something that one of the speakers said yesterday. Then obviously the bank management has got to be bold, they got to be entrepreneurial, and they got to execute and not maybe take regulatory things as a hideaway. Somebody I think also said speed is a factor. You can't really drag it on forever. Once you've done this decision, execute.
You have to get it
timely.
done. Yeah. Right, guys. So unfortunately, time's running. So let's come. I think we should draw a conclusion. So I have one last question to both of you. Imagine later at the Beyond Pretzels or at the next coffee break, you're talking to a CEO of a bank or to a bank manager, and he's struggling. He's not sure, should I renew my infrastructure? It's important to do this, but there's also a high investment. What is your killer argument, or what would you tell him to start it right now?
Do you want to end up with, like Mercedes, betting on the diesel and then someone else invented the electric car and you are stuck? Or do you want to think about the electric car and be prepared for a completely new way our mobility is organized? And that starts with the engine and ends with the mobile app organizing all your mobility, train, car, whatever. As I said, diesel or the modern electric car. Where do you want to stand?
All right. And what about you?
There's not really much I can add, because when we got together, we kind of thought that would be a picture and an image that probably stays well with the audience, we hope. Thank you so much.
So if I would be a bank manager, I would be convinced now. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us, your thoughts with us. And I think you're both here for a while, so if you have any questions left, just feel free to ask them. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the conference. And thank you for listening.